There are major demonstrations going on in Puerto Rico right now. I don't know if we have any footage of it. So in the last couple of weeks or week or so, there's been a scandal that has been set off by the a big set of leaked telegram and text messages between the governor, Ricardo Rosselló, and various members of his team, supporters, cabinet, and so on. Part of the top lines has been that this is, there's a lot of just sort of crude stuff. There's a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia, so on. There's a lot of really disgusting comments about poor people and so on. And they've said, hey, it's just us kind of blowing off steam. But the more broad and really the structural stuff and the things that are actually dropping today point to bribe and corruption networks in the Puerto Rican government. So then there's massive demonstrations taking place on the street. They've been met with riot gear and a really brutal response. Celebrities like Ricky Martin and Benicio del Toro have actually flown back to back the protests.
Ricky Martin was mentioned in the text messages
because it was a homophobic.
Ways, right?
Yeah, it was a homophobic comment about Ricky Martin, exactly. And this is really important, and all solidarity with Puerto Rico. Obviously, I think that right now it would be fair to say there isn't a specific cast to this right now. It does seem to represent a pretty broad section of society that are just sort of totally disgusted by the corruption, the buffoonishness, the bigotry of Ricardo Rosselló and the current Puerto Rican government. And the broader conversation you always have to have with Puerto Rico, though, is that if these corruption networks and these revelations go deeper, I have no doubt that you will see connections to politicians, obviously, from both parties in the mainland. You will see how a small group of corrupt politicians and networks have benefited from a colonial system in Puerto Rico that is shockingly unjust to most Puerto Ricans, that benefits predatory capital and hedge fund managers in the mainland. And you'll also have to get to the bigger history here of a truly brutal colonization. If you read Nelson Denis's War Against All Puerto Ricans, you'll know of periods of U.S. military administered martial law in Puerto Rico, of Puerto Rican independence activists becoming political prisoners, of mass killings. That's all been in Puerto Rico. Then you add in Vieques, the island of Vieques had which is a small. I mean, I spent some time there recently. It's a very ecologically vulnerable, small and high poverty levels place. The U.S. military was testing serious munitions on the island. Local people died in military accidents as well. And people are reporting that the protests against the government are the biggest seen in Puerto Rico since the movements against the U.S. military testing in Vieques. So this is really significant. But I want to bring that bigger context in because ultimately, whether it's McKinsey, I did a conversation obviously about McKinsey's role as consultants in administering increasing poverty and slashing public education in Puerto Rico. All of the same systems of corporate domination and austerity linked with corrupt local political structures and capital are all in Puerto Rico, amplified by the fact that it still is literally a U.S. colony in actuality. Taxation without representation, like D.C., like Guam. A new poll was released saying that recently, actually today, reported in Politico, that two-thirds of Americans support statehood for Puerto Rico. 2 in 3 Americans support statehood for the island of Puerto Rico, according to a Gallup poll released Thursday morning. The 66% support for admitting the island as the 51st state is consistent with polling dating back to the early 1960s. Support is highest amongst Democrats, younger voters, and non-white voters. But nearly half of Republicans also back the proposal, which is impressive. Party leaders do not. Then it goes on to talk about Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell's despicable and bigoted treatment of Puerto Rico. Although, again, this is a very bipartisan thing. Democratic Party's relationship to Puerto Rico is incredibly pernicious and in some cases deeply corrupt.
That difference between the GOP leadership and the GOP voters. GOP is basically the GOP itself, the actual body of like basically political hacks, is like the mind, the racist mind, and the voters are the GOP partisans are the racist heart of America.
Right. And so I always say, look, I mean, Puerto Rico is a colony. Puerto Rico should choose its own fate, whether it wants independence as a nation state or if it wants to be a state in the United States. It should be 100% up to Puerto Ricans. But as a matter of both, the right thing to do and political strategy, every single Democrat should be pushing every single second for Puerto Rican statehood. It is a bare minimum, and I would frame it as have a referendum and Puerto Rico decides. Obviously, the status quo is completely unacceptable. It is a colony in one of the most economically. I mean, if you look at things like the Jones Act, the fact that Puerto Rico has to pay an importation tax on some of its own products that it self-produces, but has to go back out of the country and be re-imported in. It's an obscene, exploitative system. So it needs to be up to them. But every single Democrat should be saying, if they want it, we will fight our hearts out for a 51st state with Puerto Rico, as well as voting representation, obviously, for Washington, D.C., Guam, and also there's actually several Caribbean islands that could fall into this as well. But Puerto Rico is central focal point of that. And these protests are incredibly important.